kind of a remodeling of a classic Blenko form designed by Winslow Anderson. It was 967, I believe, was the original wear number.
In the United States, we've also had, and in most countries, a third, less important factor that has contributed to excessive increases in the quantity of money. And that has been mistaken policies by the central bank. Professor Segan referred to the mistake of the Federal Reserve Bank in the late 20s, early 30s. From 1929 to 1933, the quantity of money in the United States went down by a third. And that was a major factor that produced the catastrophe. That was a great mistake of the Federal Reserve. It learned from that mistake. Government agencies, like people, don't always make the same mistake the next time, they make a different one. And since that period, the central banks have tended to make the mistake in the opposite direction. Their mistake has almost always been caused by confusing their function, by thinking that they had something to do with interest rates, instead of recognizing that their real function was to control the quantity of money. Now, most of you will be inclined to say, well, that's all very well, but aren't there some important things you've left out?
As we walk in,
of course, the most obvious thing you would have told me I left out was trade union behavior. But I hope I've already persuaded you that that's not a fundamental source of inflation. Trade unions may do a great deal of harm in a great many ways. Trade unions have done Britain enormous harm, but they are not responsible for Britain's inflation. Higher wages are in the main a consequence of inflation and not a cause of it. And as I say, the examples of these charts I gave you before, I hope, will show that anybody who thinks that's a fundamental cause of inflation had better pause for a bit. But there are two other factors that people are inclined to cite. One is to say, what about international influence? The government is particularly fond of citing this, to say, oh, well, you mustn't blame us for inflation. We've imported it from abroad. There's a worldwide inflation, and how can you expect the United States to stay clear of inflation if all the rest of the countries of the world are inflated? Now, that was a valid explanation before 1971, when we had a worldwide system of fixed exchange rates. In that case, it is true that inflation in one country would tend to spill over into another because it would influence the quantity of money. In that case, it was inflation in America that produced in the United States produced inflation in many countries around the world because their currencies were linked through a fixed exchange rate with ours. But today, that explanation is not valid. As long as countries have variable, floating, flexible exchange rates between their currencies, inflation is a national phenomenon and not an international phenomenon. And the proof of that is very simple. If inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, but it's not an international phenomenon. You know, in every country of the world you have too high taxes. But high taxation is not an international phenomenon. It's just that all the nations of the world do it at the same time. In the same way, you have inflation in many countries. But if it were an international phenomenon, how come it's roughly 0 to 1% in Switzerland, 4 to 5 or 6% in Germany, 10% in France, 18% in Great Britain, maybe higher than that in Italy, and so on down the line? No, inflation is a national phenomenon produced by monetary policy and other policies within the country. Now, the second argument that will be made, you've left out of this picture productivity. In those charts, what was it that I connected with prices? It was not simply the quantity of money, it was the quantity of money per unit of output. And it's true. Anything that increases output will tend to hold down prices. And so it's very common for people to say, well, the real source of inflation is that our productivity has not been increasing as much as it should. Or to say that the real cure for inflation is to increase productivity. Now, productivity is an enormously important phenomenon from the point of view of our standard of life, of how well we live. There's nothing that's more important. If we can get a rate of real growth of 3% instead of 2%, that will make a great difference over a period of time. And I don't doubt that one of our national problems is a fall off in the growth and productivity. But from the point of view of inflation, it's the wrong order of magnitude. It would be a tremendous achievement to raise the average rate of growth of real output in this country from 3% a year to 4% a year. That would be a 33.33% increase. It would be a dramatic change. But it would reduce the rate of inflation by 1 percentage point a year. And from that point of view, the possible variations in the quantity of money are much greater than the variations in output and productivity. So from the point of view of inflation, productivity is very much of a bit actor on the stage. The lead, the hero or the villain, as you wish it, is not productivity, but what happens to the quantity of money. Now, so much for the cause of inflation. It's very easy to say what the cure is. There's no problem how to stop inflation. That's the easiest thing in the world to say. In order to stop inflation, you have to have the government spend less and print less. That's the only way you're going to stop inflation. That's the one and only cure. But you know, the real problem isn't to know how to cure inflation. The real problem is to have the political will to do so. If I may go back to my medical analogy, some years ago my physician told me about a young man who was a patient of his who had a debilitating disease, as a result of which his fingers were threatening to fall off, his toes were threatening to fall off. And my physician said, you know, that young man could be cured in no time. The only thing he has to do to be cured is to stop smoking. But I cannot in any way bring him to stop smoking. He refuses to do it. Now, the disease was curable in one sense, but it was not easy to do it. An analogy that in some ways is much closer to the problem of inflation. It's a very literal analogy, but also something of a medical analogy is alcoholism. The thing about alcoholism is that when you go out on a tooth, the good effects come first, and the bad effects only come the next morning when you have the hangover. Now that's exactly the way it is with inflation. When you start inflating, the good effects come first. After all, the government's printing money, everybody thinks he's richer, he's got all these pieces of paper. And initially it does have that effect. It makes business good, it expands output. It's only after a while, when it works its way through to inflation, that the bad effects come later, and you then have inflation. Similarly, on the other side, the great problem in curing an alcoholic is that the bad effects come first, and the good effects come later when you try to cure it. If a man who has been subject to a craving for alcohol goes off the wagon, it's terrible. He's got a terrible time getting rid of his craving. But if he once can succeed in doing so, everything will be fine. It's exactly the same thing with inflation. If you succeed in slowing down inflation, you will initially have some very difficult time. Just as inflating stimulates the economy temporarily, so slowing down inflation slows down the economy temporarily. A more direct reason why it's difficult to apply the cure is because it's not so clear that people want to stop inflation. If I ask people, are you in favor of inflation or not? Everybody's against inflation. But when I explore a little bit further, if I say to people, tell me, have you gained from inflation? Oh, no, you say. I haven't gained. And yet the fact is that a great many people have gained from inflation. There are many, many people who have benefited. Of course, the major gainer from inflation is the Federal Treasury, as I've already said. But almost everybody who has bought a home in the past 30 years has gained from inflation. He was able to borrow on a mortgage, which inflation has paid off along with paying off the government debt. So that almost all homeowners in this country are beneficiaries from inflation. Indeed, one of the things that makes inflation such a bad social disease is precisely that it tends to be divisive. Because some people do very well during an inflation period, and some people do very badly. And as a result, the population gets split into people who are seeming in great prosperity and people who are in great distress. When most people say they want to stop inflation, what they mean is that they want the prices of the things they buy to go down and the prices of the things they sell to go up. But since what one man sells is what another man buys, that's a neat trick if you can do it. And as a result, people aren't really serious when they say they want to stop inflation. Certainly not in the early stages, not before they fully understand, not before it's gotten to the point where it is really creating serious social problems. Everybody wants to stop inflation at somebody else's expense. Now, I've already said that if you start to cure inflation, you will get some bad effects first. Let me emphasize that those bad effects are not themselves a cure. They are side effects of a cure. If you have your appendix out, you go to a doctor and say, I have and he says, you have appendicitis, you've got to take your appendix out. But after your appendix is out, you'll have to stay in bed. It used to be 2 weeks, now it's 10 minutes. But you'll have to stay in bed for a little bit. And you say to him, well, you know, I think I'll just stay in bed and not have the operation. That isn't going to cure you. And in the same way, unemployment is not a cure for inflation. I can tell you 100 ways to create unemployment that will produce more inflation, not less. I may say that used to be a proposition that people found it difficult to understand. But the experience of the past 10 years or so has done a great deal to make people understand that it's perfectly possible to have unemployment and inflation go along simultaneously. In fact, we've coined some ugly new words like stagflation and slumpflation to try to explain this phenomenon. Well, I shouldn't say to explain it, to name it. So unemployment is not a cure for inflation, but it is an almost inevitable side effect of an effective cure. Now, why should that be? Why is it that there seems to be no way to cure inflation without going through at least a temporary period of relatively slow growth and relatively high unemployment? The answer is fundamentally because of the time delays between the turning of the printing press and the ultimate effect on output and on prices. Both ways produce the same result. Look on the upgrade. Suppose the government first prints money and spends it to pay for its expenses. To begin with, the people who find themselves doing better business don't know what the explanation is. Government is paying more money, its employees have better salaries, they're coming to the store and buying more goods. The storekeeper is delighted to sell them at the same prices as before. Each man thinks this is something special happening to him. The shoe manufacturer says, oh, look, I can sell more shoes. The demand for shoes is going up. He doesn't recognize that what's really happening is that demand is going up everywhere. And then not only is the demand for shoes going up, and he's going to have to pay more to get labor, he's going to have to pay more to get leather, he's going to have to pay more to produce his product. But when that shows up, when after a while he finds out that his costs are up, then he suddenly discovers that he has to raise his prices to make both ends meet. And that's why, on the average in the United States over the past 100 years, an increase in the quantity of money has taken about 5 or 6 months to affect people's spending. The first thing that happens is people just have bigger bank accounts. Then it takes them a little while to realize that, and they start spending. And then it's another 12 to 18 months before that works through into prices. So on the average, over the past 100 years, and Britain has been for 200 years, I say 100 years because that's as far back as our data go in the United States, there's been about a 2-year interval between a more rapid increase in the quantity of money on the one hand and the inflationary effects of it on the other. But the same thing happens the other way. If the government slows down its spending, in the first instance, people simply experience that as slower demand for their products, and they tend to retrench. They tend to say, well, my inventories are going up, I better cut back production. It's only after a considerable interval that that's reflected in lower prices or in a slower rate of increase in prices and works its way through. So there is no way that I know to avoid the interim effect of slowing down inflation. In the long run, there is no relation between inflation and unemployment. On the average, suppose a country gets accustomed to 10% inflation. That's perfectly livable. That's something people can get along with. What'll happen? Everybody will know that it's going on. All wages will automatically tend to go up by 10% more a year than they otherwise would. All prices will tend to go up by 10% more. Instead of interest rates being 5%, they will be 15%. Everything will get adjusted to. And we have a great deal of evidence that the average rate of inflation over a period of time has no relationship at all with the average rate of growth or the average level of unemployment. The thing is that only surprises matter. It isn't inflation that produces a stimulus. It's only higher inflation than you expect. It's only the surprise. If you get adjusted to it, it doesn't do any good. It's just like, again, alcoholism and drug addiction. When a fellow first gets started on drinking, all it takes is one drink to make him happy. But after his body gets adjusted to that, it takes a little more, and pretty soon he's taking a half a bottle. Similarly, with drugs, it takes bigger and bigger doses to have the same effect. And similarly with inflation. As a country gets accustomed to higher and higher rates of inflation, it needs a bigger dose to have any stimulating effect. So in the long run, there is no relation, but in the short run, there certainly is. There's no way to avoid these side effects, but those side effects can be minimized by trying to take the cure gradually instead of overnight. Here we are in this nation with a base rate of inflation at the moment somewhere around 7%. It would be a mistake to try to bring that down to zero next year. We ought to do it over a 3 or 4 year period to give people a chance to adjust. We can also minimize the side effects of inflation, in my opinion, by adopting a widespread program of escalator clauses, particularly with respect to government obligations, particularly with respect to taxes. I think it is a disgrace and a scandal that we have not had a legislation which has adjusted the income tax system so that inflation does not automatically raise rates. Congress has been very quick to index its own salaries. Congress has been very quick to index the salaries of government employees. but it has been very reluctant to apply the same principle to the taxes that it imposes on the citizen. I must say myself, I would go the other way. I would like to see the taxes indexed, and with respect to the salaries of Congress and of government officials, I would index them perversely. Every 5% inflation is a 5% reduction in their salary. And I assure you, if you did that, you'd cure inflation real fast. One more general point. What if we don't cure inflation? We have no good choices. If we don't cure inflation, if we continue at high rates of inflation, we'll also have high unemployment. And one of the main reasons is because of the false cures that will be attempted. In every country that has had great inflation, the governments have resorted sooner or later to wage and price controls, supposedly as an attempt to cure inflation. We did that in this country in 1971 with disastrous results. Wage and price controls are not a cure for inflation. In fact, wage and price controls, you will find, are imposed by governments that want to inflate, but want to conceal it from the populace. Governments want to get a short-term benefit by pumping up the economy, but they want the populace to think they're doing something about inflation. So they announce with great fanfare that they're fixing prices and wages. But the result is only to hold down, to conceal the inflation for a year or two and then have it blow up, which is, of course, exactly what happened after 1971. In light of this background, I come to the final point I want to make. I think it's very instructive to look at recent U.S. history. Our inflation really started in the post-war period in the 1950s. In the 1950s, we first had a very substantial inflation during the Korean War, and then after that was over, we had a creeping inflation. It was an accident that 1950s inflation didn't continue and grow from that point on. But we had a political accident. We had a non-political president who was willing to risk the election of his vice president in order to stop the inflation. Mr. Eisenhower was willing to take the unpopular measures that stopped inflation, that put us back on a non-inflationary source, by approving measures that led to a series of recessions in 1958 and then in 1960, by holding down government spending, holding down government money creation, so that from an inflation rate, which at that time was regarded as terrible, of 3.5%, it was brought back to essentially zero. Our real inflation started in the early 1960s, when John F. Kennedy inherited this windfall of a non-inflationary environment as a result of President Eisenhower's policies. And from 1960 on, we have been on a roller coaster. We have been going up in inflation, we have been coming down. We've been going up, and we've been coming down. Every time we go up, there's a great outcry, we have to do something about stopping inflation. And so we tend to step on the brakes. That tends to produce a downturn. But the moment unemployment starts going up, there's an even bigger outcry. We have to do something about the unemployment. So we reverse and step on the accelerator instead of the brake, and we're off again. But this roller coaster is around an upward level. It's not been on the level. Each peak has been higher than the preceding peak. Each trough has been higher than the preceding trough. In 1961, the lowest rate of inflation at that time was 1%. In 1967, the next trough, the lowest rate of inflation was 2.5%. In 1971, before Mr. Nixon introduced price controls, in order to control what was then supposed to be the horrendous rate of inflation of 4.5%. In that period, the lowest rate was about 4%. In 1976, last year, when again we went through a recession to stop the inflation, the lowest rate was 6%. It was 5%, I'm sorry. So each bottom rate has been higher than the preceding one. Similarly, each top rate has been higher than the preceding one. In 1966, we reached 4%. In 1969, we reached 6%. In 1974, we reached 12%. In 1979, we will reach, you fill in the numbers. It's not a pleasant prospect. So we've been on a roller coaster, going up and up and up. And we've been on that roller coaster because of the problem that I've mentioned, that we get accustomed to our addiction, and we need bigger doses to get another high. If we look at the most recent period, we've had the same situation again. From January 1974 to January 1975, the quantity of money defined to include the currency in your pockets and all deposits at commercial banks, demand and time, what has come in the jargon of the literature to be known as M2. I apologize for having given it that unlovely name, but M2 has been grew in that year at 6.8% a year. That was a relatively low rate. And it was that was responsible for the tapering off of inflation, so that by the end of 76, it was down to about a 5% on a year-to-year basis. But in the period from January 75 to now, the money supply has been running at the annual rate of 10% a year. M2, this quantity of money. And that portends an increase in the inflation rate. We've hit the bottom and we're now on the way up. We had a temporary bulge in January, February as a result of the very hard winter. But the more fundamental phenomenon is that we're now on an upgrade. We'll probably hit 7 to 9% next year, something like that. And the base rate of inflation today is somewhere in that level. The tragedy of this whole history is that we have time and again, 4 times now, paid the price of stopping an inflation and not gotten the benefit. We've stepped on the brakes. We've slowed down the monetary expansion. We've taken a recession. We've had unemployment. And then just as inflation is starting to taper off, we throw the whole ball game away by going to the races again with the printing press. Unfortunately, given these mistakes, at the present time, the options open to this country are only bad options. We don't have good options. If you were sitting in at the Federal Reserve Board and deciding on monetary policy, you mustn't suppose you'd have anything good you could do. Whatever you do is bad. Given the amount that you have now of money that has now been pumped into the economy, you have only 2 bad choices. If you slow down drastically in order to try to hold back inflation, the economy will experience a recession in late 78, early 79, and it may be a fairly severe recession. Alternatively, you can say, well, we can't do that. We've got to step on the gas, keep doing what we're doing now. Then you are condemning the economy to going into another period of double-digit inflation. 2 years ago, there was a choice. Having paid the price for slowing down the inflation, we should have continued on a relatively slow rate of monetary growth, and then we would by now be well on the way to a cure for our inflation. But we have not done so. And as I say, I don't really blame the people who are doing it. The real blame has to be put on us, the citizens, the voters of this country, for not telling our government what we want them to do. And I am afraid that we shall have to go through several more of these swings in the roller coaster before the American people decide that they have had enough of it, and that it's time to bring it to an end, that it's time to send an unmistakable message to Washington: we want you to stop the roller coaster. When we do, there is no technical difficulty about stopping. Let me emphasize, it will not be costless to stop it, but it will not be costless to continue what we're doing. If I may conclude with my medical analogy, if you're sick, it's very, very seldom that a doctor can give you a cure which will enable you to rise from your bed the next day, a whole person, completely unaffected by your illness. We have a disease called inflation. Fortunately, our basic constitution is strong. This is a strong, healthy country, although we've been doing our best to make it unhealthy. We've been doing our best to take measures that will reduce our productivity. But nonetheless, we're still a pretty strong, healthy country. There's nothing basically wrong with it. But we have been suffering from a self-imposed disease of inflation. Sooner or later, I am sure we will get up the will to cure it. But we shall not cure it or continue it without paying a price either way. Thank you.